What's going on, guys? Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to be using the Django REST framework to build a simple API. Before we actually build that API, I want to explain what Django REST framework actually is. So we have Django, which is a Python-based framework to build web applications. But part of Django, we have the Django REST framework, which is a library to build APIs. So Django REST framework is a great choice if you're looking to create public APIs or simply an API to transport data to your own apps. In this video, we're going to build an API that can get data, create data, update data, and also delete that data. So let's head over to our terminal to get started. I'm in my Visual Studio Code. I've got my terminal open, and the first thing we want to do is create a Python environment. So I'm going to do python 3-m virtual environment, so venv, and then we'll give it a name and we'll call it environment, so m for short. It's going to create this environment folder here. Then we want to activate it, so we're going to do source, the name of our environment folder, and then /bin/activate. You can see it's going to activate our environment. We're going to have this env on the left here, but that's for using a Mac. So if you're using Windows, you want to do .env, so the name of your environment folder, /scripts/activate.bat. So that's if you're using a Windows. But because we have it activated, now we need to install everything we need. So we're going to install Django by pip3 install Django, and now we'll just install there. And then we need to install Django REST framework, so we'll do pip3 install Django REST framework, and now we'll install there. So now we have everything installed. We're going to create a Django project, so we're going to do Django admin start project, and we'll call it my API. It's going to create this Django project here. We need to go into that Django project, so cd into my API, and then we're going to create our Django app. So we're going to do python 3 manage.py start app, and we'll call it base. Okay. So if you open your my API folder, you can see we have this Django app we just created called base, and we also have another folder called my API. So if you go into my API and then scroll down to settings.py, just take this terminal down. You want to scroll down to find installed apps. So this array here, this is going to have all the installed apps which we just created. Okay, so we want to add Django REST framework, which is written as REST_framework, and we also need to add our Django app, which we called base. Okay, so that's all the configuration we need for our settings.py file. So you can just go ahead and close that. Now the first thing I want to do is create a model so that we have data to transport over our API. So if you go into base and then scroll to models.py, we're going to create a simple model called item, which is just going to have a name attribute. So we'll do class item models.model, and then we'll have an attribute called name, which will be a character field. So models.char field, and then it needs to have a maximum length, so the maximum amount of characters it can have, which we'll just say 100. So that's our model. But our problem is at the moment is that we can't just transport this over our API because it's not the correct data type. The correct data type it needs to be is in JSON format. Okay, a JSON format looks a bit like this. So it would have its name attribute, and it would have a name, for example, item1. So it's not in this format currently, and we need to put it in this format. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to pass it through something called a serializer, and we can create that ourselves. So if you go into the base folder and create a new file called serializers.py, we're going to make a few imports. So we're going to do from REST framework import serializer, and then from .models import our model we just created, import item. And now we're going to create our serializer class. So class item serializer, and then serializers.model serializer. And then inside that, we want to do class meta. And then we're going to pass in the model we just created, so item. And then we also need to state the fields we want to send across. So we want to pass over the item's ID and the item's name. So the name attribute we created here, and it automatically has an ID, okay? Should be a colon. Now we can serialize our item, we can turn it into JSON format, we can actually send it across our API. So let's actually create our APIs. So head over to views in your base folder, and then we're going to create our APIs, but let's head over to the Django REST Framework documentation. So in Django REST Framework documentation, you're going to go to views, then scroll down to function-based views, where we're going to be using the @API decorator, okay? So you can see it looks a bit like this. And what we want to do is just import these. So copy and paste them. So we're using @API view decorator, and it needs to return a response, as you can see here. So we'll just write it like this. So the first API we're going to create is an API that gets all our items. So it's going to be a GET request. So @API view, and then we pass in an array with GET inside. And then we need to give it a function name. So we'll do it GET items. And then we're going to grab all the items from our database by doing items equals. Actually, first we need to import our model. So from .models, import item, and also import your serializer. So from .serializers, import item serializer. So yeah, we're going to grab all the items from our database. So item.objects.all. Now we've got all the items from our database, we need to turn them into JSON format. So we're going to do serializer equals item serializer, pass in all our items. And because it's going to be an array of them, we have multiple of them, we need to pass in many equals true. And now what we want to do is return a response of the array of items, okay? So it's going to be the data in our serializer, which will be the array of items in JSON format. So that's our first API created. Now what we need to do is we want to be able to call this, so we need to give it a root name, okay? So the way we're going to do that is we're going to go to our base folder again, create a new file called urls.py, and then we're going to, from Django.urls, import path. And then we also want to do from .views, import the API we just created. So import get items, okay? And then we want to create a array called URL patterns, which is going to include all the different APIs we create. So we'll do path, and then we'll do /item/, and then pass in the API name. So get items. So when we call items, it's going to return the list of all the items in our database. Now, at the moment, we're not actually calling this URL patterns array. So we need to call this from our MyAPI folder in our urls.py file here. So you should already have this. If you click on that, you can see we have another one. We have the URL patterns here. So we want to call our urls.py file in our base folder. So if you import include, we're going to create another path, and we're going to include base.urls, so our file here. And then we want to give it a name, so we'll do API/. So when we call API/items, it's going to get all the items from our database, okay? So if I just bring our terminal back up, we need to migrate our model into our database as it's a new model. So we'll do python3 manage.py make migrations, and you can see it migrates our model. Then we need to actually migrate it, so we'll do python3 manage.py migrate. You can see it's going to do a list of migrations. Okay, now that's done, I want to call our API, but at the moment we don't actually have any data in it, so I want to put some data in it. So to do that, we're just going to open up the Django shell. So we'll do python3 manage.py, and then shell. It's going to open this Python shell here. And then we can actually add data from here. So if we do from base.models, import item, and then we'll create an item instance. So we'll do data item, pass in a name, which we'll call item1. And then we want to save this into our database. So data.save. So that's added it to our database. Now what we want to do is actually run our API so that we can call it. So we're going to do python3 manage.py run server. You can see we're running on here. So if you copy and paste that into your browser, and then we're at the URL /API/items. And you can see we get a list of all our items and the one we just created in our shell, okay? So that API is fully working. Now what I want to do is to be able to add some items to our list here without using the shell. So we use an API to actually add items. So head back to your VS Code and then open views.py. We're going to create a new API, which is going to be a post request. And we'll call it create item. It's going to be a request. And now what we're going to do is we want to get the data from our request. So the data we pass to our API. So we'll do data equals request.data. And this is going to include the name we pass to it. So say I wanted to add a name called item2. So now we want to create this item object. So we'll do item.objects.create. And then its name is going to be equal to data name. So the name we pass into it. And then we want to pass this into a serializer so that it's in JSON format. So serializers equals item serializer. Pass in our item, and then we only have one this time, so many is going to be equal to false. And then we just want to return response with the serializer, okay? Serializer.data. So now we want to be able to call this API. So head back to your base URLs file, and then we're going to import create item. And then create a path, which is going to be create/item/, and then pass in our create item function. So now we can call this. So if you head back to your browser, just copy and paste this, but this time it was API/create item. So you can get this web page here. It's going to say not get method allowed, but we can actually pass in some data here and then post it. So if I create some JSON, it's going to have the name attribute, and we'll just say item2 this time. Okay. If you post that, you can see it worked. We got HTTP 200, means it worked. If you go back to our get items API and you can see we've got our new item in here. So it did post it to items. So that's our get and create APIs. Now what I want to do is to be able to edit an item, okay? So I want to be able to get this item and then change its name. So go back to your VS Code, open your views.py. Then we're going to do @API view, put, then we'll do update item. So this time we're going to pass in a request, but we're also going to pass in the ID of the item here, so as PK. So we're passing in the ID so we can update that individual item, okay? So if I get the data, so data equals request.data, so the new name we're giving it. And then I want to fetch that item from our database. So I'm going to do item equals item.objects.get. We'll do pk equals pk. So if the ID matches the ID we're passing in, we're getting that item. But what we want to do, we want to handle an edge case just in case this is invalid. So say I passed in an ID which doesn't exist in our database. I'll put it in a try except, sorry. And then we want to do item dot does not exist. And then we'll just return response. PK doesn't exist, or ID doesn't exist. However, if our ID does exist and we can get our item, we want to create our serializer. So we're going to serializer equals item serializer. And we're going to pass in our item, the new data we want to update it with, and then something called partial equals true, so we can update one attribute at a time. And then we need to check if the serializer is valid, otherwise it won't work. So if it's valid, then we can save our changes, so save our data changes to the database, so serializer.save, and then we'll turn a successful response with the user's data, so serializer.data, okay? However, if it goes past this because it wasn't valid, then we need to just return the errors it throws, so return a response with the serializer errors instead. So that's our update item function, so we can go to URLs so we can call it. So update item, then we'll create a new path, so update /item/, and this is going to be a bit different because we're going to have to pass in the item's ID at the end of the URL. So we're going to do something called int for integer, and then the primary key, which is going to be the item's ID. Okay, so that's going to be at the end of the root, and we pass in our update item API. Okay, now we can go to our browser and then call this. So copy this, and then we're going to change this to update item, and then we're going to update the second item instead. What we want to do is we want to update our second item so that the name is now item 3. Okay, so we'll do name, and then we'll call it item 3, and then do that, and you can see that it becomes item 3 now. And if we get all of our items, it's item 3. Okay, so if I go back, that's update, create, and get APIs done now. The last one we need to do is create a delete request. Okay, so I'm going to create a new API, and it's going to be a delete request, and then we'll call it delete item. It's going to pass in a request and then a primary key again, so we know what item we're deleting. And for this, we can just copy and paste this logic here. So we're grabbing the item, and if it doesn't exist, it will throw an error. But all we have to do is just do item.delete. Okay, but we need something to return. Obviously, we haven't got an item to return anymore, so we're gonna have to make some imports. So if we do from REST framework status, we put import no content. Okay, so we'll return this. So return response, we'll do status equals no content. Okay, and then we'll create a root for this, import our delete item, and then create a new path. It's going to be similar to the update, so it's going to be delete /item/ the ID we're getting, so like this, and pass in our delete API. Now we can call this as well, so just copy and paste this. We'll just delete the second item, so if I do delete and then do 2, and you can see we've got this delete button here. If I just delete that and delete, because we don't get any there you go, HTTP4 no content, and then we can go to get items, and this ID here shouldn't exist anymore, and you can see it doesn't. Okay, so that's it for the simple tutorial. Hope this helped you learn Django REST framework, and if it did help you, could you please subscribe to the channel and like the video, as it takes me a long way. Thank you.